When my son told me he was getting married, I was over the moon. But when I met his fiance's family, everything changed. They looked at me, not as a mother, but as trash. Her mother whispered loud enough for me to hear. "She looks like a maid, not a mother-in-law." I smiled politely and pretended not to hear. They had no idea who I really was, or what I owned. I decided, right there and then, I'd play their little game. I'd be the poor, naive mother they thought I was, because when truth reveals itself, it hits harder than any slap. What they didn't know was that I had built the company their entire family worked for. My name is Jean Miller. I am 58 years old, a widow and a mother to one son, Ethan. My husband, Robert, and I built our lives from nothing. We started with a small interior design firm that grew into something bigger than we ever dreamed. But when Robert passed away 7 years ago, I stepped away from it all. I wanted peace. I wanted to live quietly. I never told my son how much we had built or how much money we had. I didn't want him to grow up entitled or spoiled. I wanted him to value people, not wealth. For years, I believed I had raised him right. He was kind, respectful, and hardworking. But everything changed the moment he met Olivia Grant. The first time he brought Olivia home, I could see the difference in him. He was proud, nervous, and eager to impress her. She was beautiful, confident, and polished in a way that made everyone else feel smaller. She shook my hand with a smile, but her eyes were scanning the house. I could tell she was judging every corner of my home, the old furniture, the faded curtains, the chipped table that Robert once fixed himself. She smiled politely and said, "Your home feels cozy." I could feel the weight behind her words. She didn't mean cozy. She meant small. I smiled back and said, "It's been through a lot, but it's home." Ethan jumped in quickly and said, "Mom likes to keep things simple." He laughed, as if being simple was something to apologize for. I watched her that day. She talked a lot about her job in marketing, her travels to Paris, and her dreams of living in a modern city penthouse. Every sentence was polished, rehearsed. I could tell she liked control. When I spoke about small joys, gardening, volunteering, or old books, she smiled like those things were beneath her. She asked once if I had ever been to Europe. I said yes once with my husband. We went to Italy. Robert wanted to see the cathedrals. She nodded and said, "How charming," in a tone that made it sound anything but charming. As weeks passed, I noticed Ethan changing. He started visiting less, calling less, and when he did, the conversations always turned to her. He talked about her family's success, their mansion, their vacations, their designer clothes. I didn't mind. Every mother wants her child to be happy. But then he started saying things that cut deep. One afternoon, he said, "Mom, could you not wear that old sweater when Olivia's parents come over? They're very classy people." I looked at him and said, "It's just a sweater, Ethan." He said, "I know, but you don't understand. They're very particular." That word, particular, stayed with me. Soon after, he told me Olivia's parents wanted to meet me at dinner. I thought it would be a chance to bond, but I was wrong. Before the dinner, I stood in front of my mirror holding 2 dresses. One was elegant, navy blue silk that Robert had given me years ago. The other was simple, beige, old. I chose the beige one. I wanted to see who they really were when they thought I was poor. When I arrived at the restaurant, Ethan's face turned red. He whispered, "Mom, you couldn't wear something nicer?" I smiled and said, "I didn't realize I needed to dress up to meet family." He sighed and told me to just be polite. I laughed inside. It was the first time my son sounded embarrassed of me. Olivia's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Grant, arrived shortly after. They were the kind of people who walked into a room expecting everyone to notice. Mrs. Grant wore pearls that gleamed under the lights. Mr. Grant had the confidence of a man who thought money could buy respect. They greeted me politely, but there was no warmth in their eyes. Mrs. Grant said, "So you're Jean? How lovely to meet you. Olivia told us you're retired." I said yes. After my husband passed away, I stepped away from business. Mr. Grant smiled thinly and said, "That must be hard, managing on your own." I smiled and said, "It has its moments." They asked about where I lived. what I did, and how I managed financially. Their questions were coded in politeness, but their tone carried judgment. Every answer I gave seemed to amuse them. When the waiter came, Mrs. Grant ordered for everyone without asking what I wanted. During dinner, she interrupted me several times, bragging about their social circle, their expensive vacations, and their upcoming charity events. At one point, she leaned toward Olivia and whispered, "Love means compromise, darling." I heard it. She wanted me to hear it. I left the dinner early. Ethan didn't even walk me to my car. I sat there for a long time, staring at the restaurant lights through my windshield. I thought about Robert, about the nights he stayed awake drafting designs for clients who never paid on time, about how we built our company with love, faith, and patience. And now my son's fiancé's parents treated me like a beggar. That night, something inside me broke. But something else also woke up. I decided I would let them believe their lie. I would play the role of the poor, naive mother they thought I was. And when the time was right, they would see exactly who I was. The weeks that followed were strange. Olivia invited me over for tea with her mother one afternoon. I wore simple clothes and an old handbag. When I arrived, their house looked like something out of a magazine. Gold-framed mirrors, imported furniture, and walls covered with pictures of vacations in Europe. Mrs. Grant talked endlessly about her social events. She looked at me with a smile that wasn't real. She said, "Jean, have you ever traveled abroad?" I said, "Once with my husband." He loved history. She said, "How lovely." Then she looked at Olivia and said, "We'll make sure the wedding venue represents both families." I could feel the insult behind the words. Both families, as if my side was a problem to manage. Olivia nodded and said, "Don't worry, Mom, I'll handle the design." The irony made me want to laugh. I had designed hotels, offices, and mansions larger than theirs, yet they thought I knew nothing about design. I smiled and said nothing. I knew silence can speak louder than words. A week later, Ethan called me again. He said, "Mom, Olivia's parents want to host the engagement party at their mansion. They think our house might be too small." My house? The one my husband and I built with our own hands. I smiled through the phone and said, "That's fine, dear. I'll bring a small gift." He hesitated and said, "Actually, Mom, Olivia's mom said maybe you shouldn't bring anything. She's planning something grand and she doesn't want it to look mismatched." I said softly, "Of course." "I understand." That night, I went into Robert's old study. I hadn't stepped inside in years. The air smelled of old paper and cedar wood. I opened the cabinet where all our company files were stored. My hands trembled as I flipped through them. Our company, Miller and Hart Interiors, was still alive. I had kept majority ownership, though everyone thought I sold it after Robert's death. I had hidden it under a holding name, quietly managing things from behind the curtain. I scanned through recent contracts and stopped at one. Grant Group Holdings. My heart skipped a beat. The same Grants who mocked me were clients of my company. My firm was designing their offices, their hotels, and even their mansion. They were paying me every month without knowing it. I stared at the documents and felt something deep inside me shift. Fate had handed me the perfect opportunity, I whispered to myself. So that's how this story wants to go. I closed the folder, turned off the light, and sat there in the dark. I didn't feel anger anymore. I felt calm. They thought I was poor, invisible, and irrelevant. They thought they were marrying into nothing. But soon they would realize they had built their pride on my foundation. I was done being silent. They wanted to see me as small. So I decided to let them, for now. Because when truth finally arrives, it doesn't knock politely. It breaks the door down. After that night in Robert's study, I couldn't sleep. The house felt alive again, like it had been waiting for me to wake up. The rain tapped softly against the windows, and I sat in his old chair with the company files spread before me. I ran my fingers over the embossed logo, Miller and Hart Interiors, the name that had once carried everything we were. My eyes landed on the Grant Group contracts again. They were due for a massive expansion project. A new hotel line, $50 million in total. The irony made me smile. The same people who looked down on me were building their dreams through the hands of the company I built. I whispered into the quiet room. Let them build. Let them think they're on top. The next morning, I called my old business associate, Clara Hart. She was Robert's former partner and one of the few people who knew the truth. When she heard my voice, she gasped. "Jean? You're alive," she said jokingly. I laughed softly. "I need your help, Clara. I need to know everything about the grant project." There was silence on the line, and then her voice softened. "So it's time, isn't it?" I said, "Yes, it's time." She told me she'd send everything. By noon, I had the entire project file on my desk. As I flipped through the pages, I saw the drawings, the budgets, the notes, every inch of it approved under my hidden signature. They had no idea their designer, their architect, their supposed savior in construction delays was me. I could have pulled the plug that day, ended their contracts with one stroke of a pen, but revenge is an art. It requires patience. I didn't want to destroy them yet. I wanted them to see what they'd lost first. A week later, Ethan invited me over to their new apartment. He said he wanted me to see where they would live after marriage. I baked him an apple pie, his favorite since childhood. When I arrived, Olivia opened the door. Her smile was thin, polite, rehearsed. She looked at the pie and said, "Oh, how sweet." I said, "I thought Ethan might enjoy something homemade." She took it from me like it was a box of old newspapers. Ethan appeared, smiling. "Mom, it's nice, right?" Olivia designed it all herself. I looked around. The apartment was beautiful, in a cold, magazine kind of way. White walls, metallic accents, no warmth, no life. It looked like a place meant to be photographed, not lived in. As I walked around, I noticed something on the wall, a framed newspaper article about the Grant family. The headline read, "Grant Group expands with new hotel chain." I smiled inside. I said, "Congratulations. That's quite an accomplishment." Olivia turned proudly and said, "Yes, my father worked so hard. They're even partnering with one of the biggest interior design firms in the state." I looked her in the eye and said, "Really? Which one?" She said, "I think it's called Miller and Hart, or something like that." Her tone carried casual arrogance. I felt a chill run through me, but I kept my voice calm. I said, "Oh, I've heard of them. They do good work." She nodded as if she knew everything about design. She said, "Yes, my father says their owner is retired now, someone old, probably out of touch." I smiled. Sometimes silence can hold more power than words ever could. Ethan didn't notice the shift in the air. He was busy talking about furniture, colors, and how Olivia's taste would make their life more sophisticated. He used that word again, sophisticated. The same word that once meant love now sounded like distance. After tea, I said my goodbyes. As I walked down the hallway, I heard Olivia whisper, "Your mom's sweet, but she doesn't really fit in with us, does she?" My heart sank, but I kept walking. I didn't turn around. I didn't want them to see me cry. That night, I opened my laptop and checked the company's financial portal. The grant's payments were behind, 2 invoices unpaid. Normally, I'd have let it slide, but this time, I didn't. I sent a polite but firm email through the official channel. "Dear Mr. Grant, as per our agreement, unpaid balances will result in immediate suspension of ongoing design services." I didn't sign my name. I simply added management. Within an hour, my phone buzzed. Clara had forwarded me an urgent message from the grant's project manager begging for an extension. I replied coldly, "Terms are clear. Payment by Friday or the contract is frozen. By Thursday, they paid in full, with a late fee." I smiled, not because of the money, but because I knew I had their attention now. Power, I realized, wasn't about shouting or threatening. It was about control. Quiet, invisible control. The following week, Olivia called me herself. Her voice sounded sugar-coated but nervous. "Jean," she said, "I wanted to ask a small favor. My parents want to invite you to the family dinner again." I hesitated. She added quickly, "It's important to Ethan, so please come." I could hear the tension in her tone. Something had gone wrong in their world. I agreed. When I arrived at their mansion that evening, I noticed everyone seemed distracted. Mr. Grant's usual arrogance was missing. He looked tired. Mrs. Grant still smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. I greeted them politely. Mr. Grant said, "Jean, good to see you again." I nodded. Dinner was tense. Olivia tried to fill the silence with small talk, but her mother kept glancing at her father. Finally, Mr. Grant cleared his throat and said, "Business has been a bit complicated lately. Some unexpected issues with one of our design vendors." I sipped my tea and said, "That must be hard." He nodded. "Yes, the firm has frozen some of our work until payment clears. It's unbelievable how ruthless these companies can be." I said, "Yes, business can be cold sometimes. You should always know who you're working with." Mrs. Grant looked at me sharply, as if trying to read something behind my calm expression. Olivia spoke quickly, trying to shift the mood, saying, "Dad, maybe it's just a misunderstanding." He said, "I hope so." Then he turned to me again and said, "Jean, you've run a business before, haven't you? What would you do if someone withheld service?" I smiled faintly and said, "I'd assume they had a reason." After dinner, Ethan offered to walk me to my car. He looked worried. "Mom, things are a little messy right now with Olivia's family, so if they seem stressed, don't take it personally." I smiled softly and said, "I never do." He hugged me and said, "You're the calmest person I know." I thought to myself, calm doesn't mean weak. Calm means ready. When I reached home, I sat on the porch watching the sunset fade behind the trees. The world outside looked peaceful, but inside me, a quiet storm was forming. I thought about Robert again, his patience, his wisdom, his belief that timing is everything. He used to say, "Never fight fire with fire, fight it with strategy." That night, I made a plan. Over the next few days, I began pulling small strings within the company. Nothing obvious, just quiet adjustments. I reassigned project managers, delayed certain approvals, and redirected emails. Every move was legal but precise. The Grants began to feel pressure. Their construction timelines slowed, their investors called for updates, and their confidence started to crack. Ethan had no idea any of this was connected to me. He just saw his future in-laws panicking, and Olivia becoming more anxious by the day. One evening, Ethan showed up at my house. He looked exhausted. "Mom, have you heard about Olivia's parents? Their project's going downhill fast. They're losing money." I feigned surprise. "Oh dear, I hope they recover soon." He said, "Yeah, it's stressful for Olivia. She's been crying." I placed my hand on his and said, "Sometimes life teaches us lessons in strange ways." He looked confused but didn't question me. When he left, I closed the door slowly and whispered to the empty hallway, "Lessons always cost something." The next morning, I received an email from Mr. Grant himself. He was requesting a private meeting with the owner of Miller and Hart Interiors. The irony almost made me laugh. He wanted to meet me, the woman he had dismissed at dinner, the one his daughter-in-law thought was beneath them. I typed a short reply through my assistant's account. "Meeting approved for next Thursday, 10 a.m., downtown office." He replied instantly, "Perfect." When Thursday came, I dressed carefully. Not fancy, but elegant. Navy suit, silver brooch, the same one Robert gave me after our first contract win. When I entered the conference room, Mr. Grant was already there, pacing. He didn't recognize me at first. He looked up and froze. I extended my hand and said, "Good morning, Mr. Grant. I'm Jean Miller, owner and founder of Miller and Hart Interiors." His face turned pale. For a moment, the silence in the room felt like justice breathing. He stammered, You're the owner?" I smiled calmly. "Yes, the very same woman you once told your daughter-in-law was probably old and out of touch. I think I fit that description quite well." He sat down slowly, speechless. I said, "I believe we have some unfinished business regarding your unpaid balances." He nodded weakly and said, "I'll fix everything. Please, let's not terminate the contract." I leaned forward and said, "I'm not here for revenge. Mr. Grant, I'm here to remind you, never underestimate someone just because they seem ordinary." When I left that meeting, the sun was shining brighter than it had in weeks. I didn't need to shout, threaten, or expose him. The look on his face was enough. I had taken back my dignity, my power, and my peace, all without saying a single cruel word. But deep inside, I knew this was only the beginning, because Olivia still hadn't learned. And soon, she would. When I left that meeting with Mr. Grant, I felt something shift inside me. For years, I had lived quietly, staying in the background, pretending to be smaller than I was. But that day, when he realized who I truly was, I saw in his eyes the same disbelief I had once seen in others who underestimated me. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about balance, about restoring what had been taken from me, not in money, but in respect. I walked out of that building with my head high, and for the first time in years, I felt alive. The city outside was buzzing, cars rushing, people shouting, life moving fast, and I stood still in the middle of it, smiling to myself. I didn't go straight home. Instead, I stopped by the company's main office, where Clara greeted me with a grin. She had already heard what happened. "I heard he nearly fainted when he saw you," she said, half laughing, half impressed. I smiled, maybe he did. "But this isn't done yet, Clara. This time I want them to feel it the way I did, slowly, quietly, until the ground beneath them starts to crack." Clara nodded and said, "You've always been good at subtle warfare." I looked out the window and said, "That's what they taught me, to fight with silence." That's what they taught me, to fight with silence. The next few days, I began executing my plan step by step. The first move was simple: exposure. I knew the Grant family valued one thing above all else: reputation. They thrived on their image of success, on appearing untouchable in their circles. So I decided to touch that image just enough to leave a mark. Using an anonymous business blog that often published industry gossip, I sent a carefully worded tip. A major hospitality expansion faces internal delays and financial mismanagement. Insiders say the Grant's empire may be in trouble. Within 48 hours, the post went live. It didn't mention their company by name, but everyone in the industry knew who it was about. Calls began flooding their office. Investors grew nervous. Their project partners started asking questions. At home, I pretended to know nothing. Ethan called one evening, his voice tense. "Mom, have you seen the news? There's some ridiculous article about Olivia's parents' company. They're really upset." I made my voice soft, calm. "Oh dear, people will say anything for attention these days." He sighed. "I know, but it's causing chaos." I said, "Tell Olivia not to worry. The truth always comes out." What I didn't say was that the truth was already out, just not the one she thought. My next step involved something far more personal. I had access to the Grant project files, including Olivia's personal notes. She had written rude remarks about staff, offensive comments about clients, and even small digs at people she didn't like, including me. She never thought anyone would see them. I didn't plan to expose them publicly, but I knew exactly who needed to see them: the investors. I compiled a report highlighting unprofessional internal communication and sent it anonymously to their project board. A week later, I heard through Clara that the board was furious. They demanded accountability, and Olivia's father was forced to take a temporary step back from leadership until an internal review was completed. Ethan visited me again that weekend. He looked lost. "Mom, everything's falling apart." Olivia's dad's been removed from the board, and she's been crying nonstop. She says someone is sabotaging them. I just nodded and said, "Sometimes people's own actions return to them, Ethan. It's called consequence." He didn't know what I meant, but I saw a flicker of thought cross his face. Days turned into weeks. Olivia began to unravel. The woman who once looked at me with superiority now barely held herself together. I'd see her at family gatherings, her eyes red, her hands trembling as she tried to smile. She would whisper to Ethan, "Things are getting worse," and I could see him growing frustrated, caught between love and confusion. I didn't enjoy her pain, but I couldn't deny there was justice in it. She had mocked me, humiliated me in front of her family, and tried to teach my son to be ashamed of his mother. Now she was learning that pride always has a price. But I wasn't done. My next move was strategic. I wanted Ethan to see the truth for himself, not through my words but through her actions. I arranged a small dinner at my house and invited them both. I cooked their favorite meals, set the table beautifully, and wore the same simple dress Olivia once mocked. When they arrived, she looked uneasy, scanning the modest home she had once insulted. I welcomed them warmly, pretending nothing was wrong. Over dinner, Ethan mentioned he might be looking for new business opportunities since things with the grants had become unstable. I smiled and said, "There's an opening at Miller and Hart. We're expanding our team." Olivia almost choked on her wine. She said, "Wait, your company? You still work there?" I looked at her, holding her gaze, and said, "I don't just work there, Olivia. I own it." The color drained from her face. Ethan stared at me in disbelief. "You own Miller and Hart?" he said quietly. I nodded. "Yes, Ethan. Your father and I built it together before you were even born." The silence that followed was heavy. Olivia's fork clattered against her plate. I could feel her entire world shifting in that moment. She had treated me like I was beneath her, never realizing I stood higher than she ever could. I said gently, "I didn't want to say anything before, because humility is a stronger test than pride. But sometimes people mistake silence for weakness." Ethan leaned back, rubbing his temples, trying to process everything. Olivia stammered, I didn't know." I said, "That's the thing, Olivia. You never cared to know. That dinner changed everything." Ethan grew distant from Olivia afterward. He began asking questions about her behavior, her parents' ethics, and the way she had treated me. I didn't interfere. I let truth do its work. Meanwhile, the grant company continued to crumble. Suppliers withdrew. Partners backed out. And every time they tried to recover, another small detail, an overlooked email, a delayed approval, a leaked memo, set them back again. None of it pointed to me directly, but every thread traced back to the decisions I orchestrated quietly behind closed doors. Weeks later, I got a call from Mr. Grant. His voice was desperate. "Jean, please, can we meet again?" I agreed. When he arrived at my office, he looked like a different man, tired, defeated. He said, "I don't know how things went so wrong. My company's falling apart, my daughter's marriage is on the brink, and I've lost everything." I looked at him for a long moment and said, "Maybe this is life giving you a chance to start over, humbler, wiser." He said, "I've made mistakes." I nodded, "Yes, we all do. But some mistakes destroy the people we love." He asked if I would reconsider continuing the business relationship. I said, "Mr. Grant, Miller and Hart values integrity above all else. We cannot associate with partners who treat people as disposable." He looked down and whispered, "Understood." When he left, I felt no triumph, only clarity. Revenge, I realized, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers through karma. A few days later, Ethan came over again. He sat quietly across from me, his eyes full of guilt. "Mom, I need to apologize. I never should have let Olivia or her family treat you that way. I was blind." I said softly, "You were in love." "It happens." He shook his head. "No, I was selfish. I thought I was protecting you from embarrassment, but I was the one who should have been embarrassed." I reached out and took his hand. "You've learned, and that's all that matters." He said, "Olivia's been begging me to talk to you. She feels terrible." I smiled faintly. "Maybe she's finally seeing beyond appearances." He asked, "Will you forgive her?" I said, "Forgiveness is easy, Ethan. But trust, that takes time." He nodded, understanding. That night, as I stood by the window watching the lights of the city flicker in the distance, I felt something I hadn't in years. Peace. I had faced humiliation, betrayal, and pain, but I had turned it into strength. They thought I was a poor, naive woman, someone who didn't belong in their polished world. But I had built that world. I was its foundation, and when they tried to push me out, I reminded them whose name was carved into the stone beneath their feet. Revenge didn't give me joy, it gave me closure. The kind that comes when justice finally finds its balance. And as I looked at the reflection of the night sky in the glass, I whispered to myself, "Never underestimate a quiet woman. We are the storms you never see coming." The days that followed felt calm on the surface, but I could sense something building beneath it. Ethan had grown quieter, thoughtful, as if every conversation we'd had lately kept replaying in his mind. Olivia, on the other hand, seemed to vanish. I hadn't seen her in almost 2 weeks. One afternoon, I was sitting in the garden trimming my roses when a car pulled into the driveway. Olivia stepped out, her face pale, eyes red, and her usual poise gone. She stood by the gate for a moment before walking toward me slowly. I didn't move, didn't speak. She finally said, "Jean, can I talk to you?" Her voice trembled, and for the first time there was no pride, no arrogance. Only fear and regret. I gestured toward the porch. We sat down, and for a few seconds silence filled the air between us. She looked down at her hands, twisting a ring around her finger nervously. Then she whispered, "I didn't know who you really were." I nodded slightly. "That's true. You never asked." She looked up, tears in her eyes. "I thought I understood everything about people. I thought success and class made me better. But now, I can't even look at myself." Her words sounded heavy, sincere. I didn't say anything at first. I let her speak. She told me how her family's company had been suspended from multiple contracts, how investors had withdrawn, and how her father had sold one of their properties to cover debts. She said Ethan had moved out temporarily to clear his head, and she didn't blame him. Then, finally, she looked at me and said, "Jean, I ruined everything, didn't I?" I took a deep breath and said, "You hurt people who loved you, Olivia. You humiliated me, you disrespected Ethan, and you laughed at the things that made our family real. But yes, life has a way of teaching lessons we refuse to learn gently." Tears rolled down her cheeks. I didn't gloat, didn't celebrate. I just sat there watching her realize what she had done. She said, "I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know I'm sorry." I sighed softly. "I believe you are, but apologies only heal when they're followed by change." She nodded slowly and whispered, "I understand." After she left, I stood in the garden for a long time, the scent of roses filling the air. I thought about Robert, about how he always told me that pride destroys more homes than poverty ever could. I had spent so many years swallowing my pride, holding back tears, pretending to be small so others could feel big. But now I felt like the world had balanced itself again. That weekend, Ethan came home. He looked tired but calmer. "Mom, I think Olivia's changing. She told me everything." I smiled faintly. Maybe she finally learned what matters. He nodded, and then he said something that caught me off guard. "Mom, she asked if she could come to dinner tonight. Would that be okay?" I hesitated. Part of me wanted to refuse. Part of me wanted to close that door forever. But another part, the softer part that still remembered how love can heal, said yes. "Tell her to come." When Olivia arrived that evening, she brought a small box with her. Inside was a framed picture of Ethan as a child, sitting on Robert's lap, a photo she'd found in their old house. She said, "I wanted you to have this back. It belongs here." I took it from her, my eyes stinging. "Thank you," I said quietly. She smiled weakly and said, "I wish I could take back the way I treated you." I replied, "You can't undo the past, Olivia, but you can decide who you'll be moving forward." Dinner was quiet but warm. For the first time, Olivia didn't try to impress or dominate the conversation. She listened, asked about my garden, about the recipes I used to make for Ethan. I could see she was trying, really trying. And as strange as it felt, I respected that. When they left later that night, Ethan hugged me tightly and whispered, "I think everything's going to be okay now." "Mom," I smiled and said, "It already is." The next morning, I received an unexpected phone call from Mr. Grant. His voice was softer, humbler. "Jean," he said, "I don't deserve your time, but I need to tell you this personally. We've decided to step back from business entirely. We're selling the company and starting over, smaller but honest this time." I was quiet for a moment, then said, "Sometimes losing everything is the only way to find yourself again." He thanked me, and before hanging up, he said something I didn't expect. "You were right. We should never underestimate quiet people." I smiled faintly and said, "Lesson learned, Mr. Grant." After that call, something inside me let go. I no longer felt the anger that had fueled me. It was gone, replaced by a strange calm. I walked through the house, touching the walls, the photographs, the memories Robert and I had built together. I whispered, "We did it, love." Justice didn't need shouting. It just needed patience. Weeks passed, and life settled into a new rhythm. Ethan and Olivia began rebuilding their relationship slowly, this time with honesty. Olivia started volunteering at a local design school, teaching young women how to manage businesses ethically. Ethan helped me reopen one of Miller and Hart's old training programs for young designers from underprivileged backgrounds. Watching them work together reminded me that people can change when they're forced to face their reflection. One evening, Clara visited. We sat on the porch, sipping tea as the sunset painted the sky. She smiled and said, "You really did it, Jean. You didn't just get revenge. You rewrote the story." I laughed softly. "No, Clara, I just reminded them who the author was all along." She chuckled. "You've always had a way with words." Then she asked, "So what's next for you?" I looked at the horizon and said, "Peace. I've spent years fighting battles in silence. Now I just want peace." That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed everything in my mind, from the moment Olivia first looked down on me to the instant she realized who I truly was. Life has a way of testing our patience, but when the moment comes to rise, it rewards those who wait. I had waited, and when my time came, I didn't destroy them. I let truth do what revenge never could, teach. Months later, I attended Ethan and Olivia's vow renewal ceremony. It wasn't grand like the first one. It was held in a small garden surrounded by close friends. When Ethan gave his speech, he looked at me and said, "My mother taught me that strength isn't about how loud you are. It's about how you stand tall when the world doubts you." I felt tears fill my eyes. When Olivia spoke, she turned toward me and said, "And she taught me that grace is more powerful than pride." The audience clapped softly, but all I heard was the beating of my heart. After the ceremony, Olivia approached me with a small bouquet of lilies. She said, "These are for you, Jean." I smiled. "Lilies? Robert's favorite." I took them and said, "Thank you, Olivia." She looked me in the eye and said, "Thank you for not destroying me when you could have." I said, "Real strength isn't about destroying others. It's about choosing not to." As the evening ended and I watched the lights twinkle around the garden, I realized my story had come full circle. The woman they once mocked had become the lesson they would never forget. I didn't need their validation or apologies anymore. I had already won the moment I stopped being afraid of who I was. Sometimes life doesn't give you justice in a courtroom or through revenge. It gives it to you quietly, through redemption, through change, through peace that settles in your heart long after the anger fades. I smiled, whispered Robert's name, and felt a warmth spread through me. Because in the end, I had acted like a poor, naive mother when I met my daughter-in-law's family. But it turned out I was the richest woman in the room. Not in money, but in grace, wisdom, and power they could never buy. If you believe dignity always wins in the end, share this story. Subscribe to Jean Stories for more tales that remind us. No betrayal goes unanswered, and no quiet heart stays unheard. After the vow renewal, life seemed to finally exhale. The house no longer echoed with silence, and for the first time in years, it felt like a home again. The garden bloomed brighter that spring, as if it too sensed that something heavy had lifted. I spent my mornings watering the roses, humming old songs Robert used to love. I wasn't trying to fill the space he left behind anymore. I was simply living in it, peacefully, gently, fully. Ethan and Olivia began visiting every Sunday. They'd bring groceries, laughter, and sometimes their silly arguments that reminded me of when Robert and I were young. I could see how much they'd both grown. Olivia wasn't the same woman who once cared more about appearances than people. She'd found purpose in mentoring young designers who couldn't afford expensive schools. Ethan helped manage her program and even started teaching part-time at the community college. Watching them work together was like watching two broken pieces slowly fit back together. One evening, after dinner, Ethan handed me a small envelope. I opened it to find flight tickets inside, to Italy. He said, "Mom, I want you to go. You always told Dad you wanted to see Florence and Venice together, so go for both of you." I smiled softly. My first instinct was to refuse. But then I remembered how many years I had spent saying, maybe someday. Life doesn't wait for someday. I looked at him and said, "Thank you, Ethan. I think I will." The next month, I was standing on a small bridge over the Arno River in Florence. The sunset painted the water gold, and I felt Robert's presence beside me, not in grief, but in gratitude. I whispered, "We did it, love. Everything we built, everything we believed in, it still lives on." I closed my eyes and smiled. For the first time in so long, there was no pain, no bitterness, only peace. When I returned home, everything felt lighter. My heart, my house, my spirit. I started writing again, something I hadn't done in decades. I began with small journal entries about forgiveness, strength, and love that doesn't break even when tested. Eventually, those entries became a book. Not for fame, not for recognition, just a gift to leave behind. A record of what it means to survive life's betrayals without losing your soul. As weeks turned into months, my little story started reaching people. One of Olivia's students shared it online, and soon messages began arriving from women I'd never met. They said, "Your words made me believe I could start over," or, "I thought I was weak until I heard your story." Each message felt like a quiet ripple from the storm I had once survived. It reminded me that even the most painful chapters can help light someone else's way. One afternoon, I sat with Olivia in the garden. The air smelled of lavender, and the sun was soft. She looked at me and said, "Jean, do you ever wish things had gone differently?" I thought for a moment before replying, "No." Because if they had, none of us would have grown. She nodded slowly and said, "You're right. Growth never comes from comfort. It comes from being broken and choosing to rebuild." I smiled. "You've learned well, Olivia." Later that evening, I went through an old box of letters Robert and I had exchanged when we were young. In one of them, he had written, "If life ever tries to humble you, let it, but never let it make you small." Those words felt truer now than ever. I had been humbled, humiliated even, by people I once trusted. But I never let it make me small. I rose, not with noise, but with quiet power. Years later, I found myself standing in front of a class of young women, the very program Olivia had started. They had invited me to speak. I wasn't used to giving speeches, but when I began, the words came easily. I told them that success means nothing if it costs you your kindness, that love is powerful but never blind, and that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is walk away with grace. When I finished, the room was silent. Then one of the girls stood up and said, "Your story changed my mother's life. She's starting over because of you." I felt tears well in my eyes. That's when I realized revenge might bring satisfaction, but purpose brings peace. That night, I sat by the window watching the city lights flicker. I thought about the years I spent in pain, about how every tear had led me here, to a place of understanding. People often think strength comes from holding on, but sometimes it's in the letting go. I let go of resentment. I let go of anger. And what remained was freedom. Ethan often jokes that I'm the strongest person he knows, but I tell him the truth. I'm just someone who learned to stand tall after being brought to my knees. Because sometimes the storm isn't sent to destroy you, it's sent to clear your path. A few months later, on my birthday, I received a simple card from Olivia. Inside it said, "You taught me what grace looks like. Thank you for saving me when I didn't deserve it." I held that card close to my heart. Forgiveness doesn't erase what happened. It just frees you from carrying it forever. As the years passed, I noticed how life came full circle. The house that once felt empty was now filled with laughter. The garden that once symbolized loneliness now stood as proof of renewal. And the woman I once was, quiet, hesitant and heartbroken, had evolved into someone unshakable. I no longer sought revenge. I sought peace, and in doing so, I found victory. Sometimes I sit alone at dusk, listening to the wind move through the trees, and I think about how strange it all is, how pain can become wisdom, and how endings can quietly turn into beginnings. I think of Robert and whisper, "We did good, love," because the legacy we leave behind isn't measured by wealth or titles, but by the lives we touch, the lessons we teach, and the kindness we choose when cruelty would be easier. In the end, this story wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming dignity, finding balance, and proving that silence is not weakness. It's power under control. I didn't shout. I didn't fight. I simply showed them who I truly was. And that was enough. If my story reaches someone who's been betrayed, humiliated, or underestimated, I hope they remember this. Your worth isn't determined by how others treat you. It's defined by how you rise after they try to break you. Never let anyone convince you that quiet strength is small. Because when the dust settles, it's the calm souls who rebuild the world. So, to everyone listening, I'll leave you with this. Sometimes, revenge looks like living well, loving harder, and smiling in the face of those who thought you couldn't survive without their approval. Choose peace, not because they deserve it, but because you do. This is Jean, and this was my story. A story about betrayal, grace, and the power of standing tall in silence. If it touched your heart, share it. Because someone out there might need to hear that it's never too late to reclaim your voice, rebuild your strength, and write your own ending. And if you've ever been made to feel small, remember, you're not. You're simply waiting for your moment to rise, because in the end, dignity doesn't need revenge. It just needs time, and the courage to walk away smiling. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Jean Stories. Every week I share tales of strength, betrayal, and redemption, reminding us that even the quietest hearts can roar when the moment is right. Until next time, take care of your heart, and never let anyone dim your light.